For a man who spent most of his career behind the camera, David Bailey has managed to retain an extremely high profile himself, since the early 60s, in fact, when his freshness as a fashion photographer and his East End image changed the status of the photographer in this country forever.
He'd had a great deal of charm, and I think a lot of Bailey's appeals, he appeals to men, women and children. I mean, everyone fancied him. He could put his hand up amazing skirts and get away with it.
He became at one and the same time the people's photographer and the photographer's photographer, because although he's shot fashion, his work has by no means been confined to it. As he enters his 50s, we decided it was time to have a look at the full range of the work of David Bailey.
The thing about photography is you need projects. You need to be obsessed with one thing. I mean, you see all those people walking around with cameras and they think they're going to be Cartier-Bresson, but they're not. I mean, if they said, right, for the next 3 years I'm just going to photograph mushrooms, they'd probably get great pictures of mushrooms. But wandering around in the wilderness thinking that... I think it's a sort of sexual replacement half the time anyway, those big long lenses they have, and they spend all their life cleaning them, never really taking pictures.
That left elbow, let it go out a little bit. No, that's the right one, Angel. Yeah, and now head back where it was, and just your eyes I'm interested in now. Yeah, keep your head there. And eyes. Good girl.
One of the things that's accompanied your career has been the myth of your career. And the myth is that you were one in a group of extremely talented working-class boys. Do you think you came from something that gave you nothing or something that gave you a lot?
My background's become a sort of joke background, really. And you see that film the other day, Borman's film. What was it called?
Hope and Glory.
Hope and Glory. I mean, that was my background totally, but a bit poorer. And everyone of my age seems to have the same references. I mean, all our heroes at that period seemed they saw as Charlie Parker, Chet Baker, James Dean, Steinbeck, maybe some dash of D.H. Lawrence. It's almost too patterned. It's almost like someone worked it all out before.
Television arts programmes are quite reluctant to make films about photographers. Was it really art? For quite a long time, we did David Bailey, who was a different sort of photographer altogether. He started his photography young, as an East End lad, and I'm going to say this with a straight face, his real interest was photographing birds in the beginning. He took lots of photographs of birds. He was and remains a keen ornithologist. And David, as it were, never looked back. He was so amiable and so much fun, and people loved working with him. He was so vivacious, and he knew what he wanted.
The first time I noticed photography was nature films. I saw some nature films, and I thought, that looks interesting. That's what I'd like to do, because I was always fascinated by animals. And so I took my mother's Brownie camera and took pictures of sparrows in the garden, basically. I wanted to be an ornithologist, in fact, but that was way beyond the... And in East End in those days, it was really... That was it. You were stuck in there. I mean, the idea of being... I became a vegetarian when I was 12 and wanted to be in ornithology, and I didn't like football. I mean, my father knew I was gay. I mean, there was no question about... I mean, it wasn't gay in those days, it was effing queer. And that was it.
After completing his national service in Singapore in 1958, Bailey came back to London, determined to become a photographer.
I looked through all the magazines and decided that the two best photographers was John French and Tony Armstrong-Jones at that period. And there was lots of others, and I wrote about 50 letters. And in fact, the only two that answered were John French and Tony Armstrong-Jones, so I was quite lucky. And I went along for an interview with John, who was a bit like Fred Astaire. Did you ever meet John French? He was very elegant. He was smoked like that, and he always had a pink tie and a grey suit. And very, very elegant. I mean, the double of Fred Astaire. And I lied to him. And I got the job through lying. And I started with John. And later I asked him, I mean, a couple of years later, I said, why did I get the job? And he said, oh, David, he said, I knew you were lying. I just liked the way you dressed.
And here is the young David Bailey, dressed in red, working with John French in 1960. Fortunately, John French not only appreciated Bailey's clothes, he also appreciated his talent and got him work in his own right. On an early assignment, Bailey met a new young model, Jean Shrimpton.
She just walked into the studio that I was working in at the time, and it was sort of instant, you know. I mean, I knew that she could be great.
Bend it, just a little more without you, baby. I'm so insecure that you...
Make that, let me, no, let the toys move. Go back to where you were. Come on, back to where you were. Good, and that flipping hand. Yeah, good, there. That's good. Now stay like that. And...
It's my Mona Lisa. It's just some magic about it. I mean, there's lots of things wrong with it, but I just love it.
Bailey and Shrimpton became the golden couple. They seemed to sum up the myth and hope of the 60s. Everyone could make it, and everyone could make it with each other.
I think our success was mainly to do with timing, because everyone had been very elegant, and I was sort of a mongrel, really, by comparison, and he was as well. And I think it's also coincided with cameras changing to 35mm, rather than big cameras we had to keep still. And I think he just portrayed me as a natural, rather scruffy girl.
Well, I photographed women the way I saw them on the streets. People could identify with Jean because I didn't make her look like a kind of stuffed kind of shop mannequin. Suddenly she was somebody you could touch or maybe take to bed even.
Yeah. Was that important?
What, to take to bed?
I mean, for the
For
public...
me it was.
I was being terrifically discreet. I mean, anyway, I knew that, but I'm talking about for the public. Was that important?
Well, I think so, because the people love couples, don't they? And that helped when Jean and I became a couple.
I mean, I think particularly for photography, there'd been this period before then when people like sort of Cecil Beaton and John French, who Bailey himself worked for, were kind of, you know, in some sense society photographers. You know, they were wealthy individuals, and you'd had these pictures that were terribly composed. The women were slightly frozen in time, and now there was a sort of jumping pictures were happening. He opened that up more, this looseness in the pictures and this kind of accessibility. You know, Jean Shrimpton didn't look like this kind of rare bird on a tropical island that no one could attain. She looked like, you know, someone you could, and I think he himself said, you know, someone you could reach out and touch and might possibly run into on the street. And that was definitely a new aesthetic in fashion photography.
But Bailey's work went beyond fashion.
These portraits captured the heroes of a new generation, people who expressed themselves with a cool directness, whether it was through words, music, or simply the way they looked.
There's Alfie, Michael Caine. Do you know that? With an unlit cigarette in his mouth. I really like this picture. This is a real Bailey 60s picture. You know, the cropping of the forehead, intense looking to the camera, and the very contrasty print. This personifies the 60s picture of mine.
He was around and part of that 60s, early 70s melee, more than movement, which is lauded, dismissed, but you can't get around it. Something happened across the arts. And that created in London, which was ready for a change, having continued to be depressed after the Second World War, all that sort of black and whiteness suddenly became Technicolor. And David, ironically of course, loved to shoot in black and white.
Look at me, Cecil. That's absolutely marvellous.
Nowadays one says lesbian, doesn't one?
We'll say lesbian a few times.
Lesbian.
Good. And again.
Lesbian?
With more feeling.
Lesbian.
That's more like
Lesbian.
When you're churning them out like I used to in the 60s, I think one year I did over 800 pages for Vogue. I mean, all the Vogues, which is a hell of a lot, and you have to learn certain tricks. And often with personalities, you get them for... They walk into the studio and say, oh, you've got 5 minutes. Now, you can't get somebody's soul in 5 minutes. I couldn't get somebody's soul in 5 years, and I certainly can't get it in 5 minutes, so you go for the next best thing. And sometimes the happy accident, you get something more than anybody else.
Your private life has run alongside your life as a photographer to some extent. Suddenly there were people like Bailey around who actually were themselves news, like a film star or at very least a television star.
You see, the thing about photographers, they become glamorous through association because you spend your time with people that other people consider glamorous, and you obviously develop friendships with some of these people. And in a way, you become, if there was a disease called celebrity disease, photographers would get it because they'd catch it after.
Bailey's most celebrated friendships have been with the models he photographed. Jean Shrimpton was the first in a series of successful partnerships.
I got sunshine on a cloudy day.
They included Catherine Deneuve, whom he married in 1965.
Then I got the month of May.
The extraordinary model Penelope Tree. And in the early 70s, Mary Helvin.
He became, you know, if you like, a symbol of the generation. You know, he was, you know, either going out with or even marrying these famous women, and, you know, he was the man about town, and he was different, and he himself represented, you know, something new about the decade. And I think in some ways, you know, later on in the 60s, his fame kind of eclipsed his photography. You know, people knew his name, but they didn't necessarily know his work. And I remember, you know, for me, when I was starting out, it was, in a weird way, almost embarrassing to say that you were a fan of Bailey's work, because it was so obvious. It was a bit like saying, you know, you liked the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
Good, Don.
Bailey's reputation has at times seemed to overshadow his work. He's never quite shaken off the image of the fashion photographer he created in the 60s.
That's wild, yeah. Great.
That image, which seemed to sum up swinging London, became the centre of Antonioni's 1967 film, Blow Up.
Mr. Michelangelo Antonioni, twitch, was involved. And in the meantime, I'd photographed his girlfriend, who was, I forget her name, she was quite beautiful.
Was that Monica Vitti?
Monica Vitti, yeah. And it was the scene from Blow Up where she was on the floor and I was on top of her photographing her. Nothing happened, nothing at all. In fact, I thought she was quite old. I mean, she must have been all of 24 or something. And he got angry about this, and we had words, and I refused to speak to him.
Okay, Reg, good fit.
No, I hated the film. I understand its meaning, but I just thought it was pretty boring.
Yes, now really good. Come on. Come on, work. Now, go on, yes! Yes!
Does it bother you at all or interest you in the slightest that despite what you've done in so-called fashion photography, and a lot of other people have done, it's still regarded by quite a few critics as just photographing pretty girls and with no substance to it?
I think most of it is. I think they're right in 99% of the cases, but I think you could say that about almost all photography. I think they're right. I think most fashion photography is crap. But
So what would you claim?
Most art's crap.
Bailey's always photographed the places he's lived in. In 1962, it was the East End. In 1982, he produced a collection documenting NW1, the area he's lived in for 25 years.
Photography is quite sad in a way because it's always about death or about decay. Half the buildings in North West One don't exist anymore. It has a Proustian scene photography. It's always about the past. Well, everything's about the past. But photography in particular because it records the past so accurately.
In the mid-80s, Bailey's work for Live Aid represented a broadening out in terms of subject matter, taking him into areas that he wouldn't have explored in the 1960s.
When you're photographing in Ethiopia, the starving children, how different is your attitude and how different is your photography? It is different from when you're photographing a model or doing a portrait or whatever.
First of all, you wouldn't accept those jobs, and I mean, I never accept money for doing those kind of pictures, by the way. That's got to be clear, because you have these very pretentious social photographers that spend their life doing it and very pompous about what they do, but they also get paid for it. So I do it for lots and lots of reasons. I do it because I feel guilty. I do it because...
What do you feel guilty about?
I feel guilty that the camera I'm using could keep one of those people, keep probably a whole family of those people for a year in Rice. I feel guilty because I'm slightly fat when I go there. I mean, that was the most... You just feel embarrassed. You feel, I wish I was thin so that I didn't stick out so much. And also, I do it for, I suppose you could say, conceit reasons, because I do it because I know I can get incredible images as well.
At the other extreme, Bailey's work still involves him in the glossy world of advertising. For the last 5 years, he's been directing commercials. This one's for Scottish Widows.
Be a bit seductive, Deborah. I've always done commercials, in fact. I think the first commercial I did was either 65 or 66. I think I was always quite good at it, but it's only in these last few years people have realised I was quite good at it. Close to the window! Cut it.
Scottish Widows. Looking good for your money.
It intrigued me that when we were making a film by David, which is a good film, Kim Evans made it, we were making a film that cost, all things considered, in the way you bulk out costs in those days, and we were on, it cost about £100,000 to make everything, and it lasted 50 minutes. And he was making a commercial that lasted 1 minute, for which his budget was £1 million. I don't know why that stuck, but it stuck.
I try and put a stamp, an individual stamp. I mean, there's a few directors that you could look at and you know that that's a Ridley Scott commercial. Or... It's quite difficult because the time the whole corporate thing's chipped a lot away, it's difficult at the end of the process to have a commercial. You say, oh, that looks like a Ridley Scott or a Alan Parker or hopefully a David Bailey.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about his commercials work is the sense of narrative.
Everyone is going through changes, and no one knows what's going on.
That wonderful ad that he did for Volkswagen of the woman clearly leaving her husband and throwing away the fur coat and the pearls, and then she keeps the car. It's just a great story, and the payoff at the end is, fantastic, and that's why you remember that ad. It's a simplification, and I think, some of his work appears very simple, but, a little bit like, some of the best Beatles songs. They sound so simple that you kind of can't understand how it's so good, and yet it's so simple.
It's one of my favourite commercials. I think it's powerful because it sets you up. I mean, it's a sort of old Hitchcock trick. It lulls you into a sort of sense of security because you think of these wonderful-looking girls and they're beautiful and everyone's having a nice time. And then suddenly the whole thing reverses on you. It's interesting looking at it again, because I haven't seen it for some time. And there's some things that you know that you probably couldn't have done better. I mean, very rarely in life, like, there's 20 photographs I know I couldn't have done better, and that commercial is, every time I see it, I think, what could I have done? Because you always miss something. But in that one, it's one of those things that everything came together.
I mean, the funny thing is, you know, we're here talking about Bailey, and I actually got to photograph Bailey for Vogue, I think a couple of years back, and he really did kind of shuffle in, actually, and he was sort of slightly gruff, and he sat down, and I remember I did 7 frames. And we looked at it, and I thought, he's going to stop now, he's going to stop. And I thought, I don't care if he stops, because I know I've got it. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both sort of smiled, and he just went, you've got it, haven't you? And I went, yeah, okay. And then he stood up, and he came over, and he went, let's have a look then, because this was all shot digitally. And he came and sat down at the computer, and I remember this so clearly. He put his arm round me, and we sat there, him with his arm round me, and we looked at the screen, and we just went through the 7, and there's one frame, and he's really looking grumpy, and I was like, well, that's the one. And he smiled, and he went, yeah, go on then.
There's a great joy about Bailey. There's a great life in him, and I think without him, the 60s and the 70s would be, or appear, or remain, a less rich place than we now see it.
You seem to have driven yourself hard for a long time. Why do you think you do that?
I don't want to be poor. I don't want to be poor.
Over the last 30 years, I mean, which part of your work are you particularly proud of, if you had to say, look...
Next week's.